if you want to level up your game and think as someone who's extremely wealthy, you have to look beyond what's going to happen in the next quarter, the next year, even the next decade, and think about what's going to happen in the next generation, the next 50 years. Today, I'm going to give you some things that I'm thinking about of how to prepare for the next 50 years. Our friend Zubi made a great comment where he said one of the biggest long-term weaknesses of every Western nation, and it's true, is nearly everybody thinks on a 1 to 4 year time horizon, basically the next election. And where I'm from in the United States, you're always in that next election. It's always campaigning. It's always this sense of in the moment, kind of urgency, like what are we doing right now? Not thinking as you'd find in, let's say, an Asian culture, what are we building for the next century? And so what he says is no Western country really appears to have a 20, 50, 100-year plan because everyone's just trying to get elected. Everyone's just trying to go in and as they say, get one last smash and grab in the next election cycle. And so this is something that I've really been thinking about as I follow long-term investors like Warren Buffett. What am I thinking about what am I going to hold on to for the next 50 years of my life? Because a lot of us, as Gary Vee would say, are going to live to be 100 and then some. And so we've got 50 years to play with. We've got the next generation to play with. What are my thoughts? I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce their taxes, protect their assets, increase their freedom, and grow their opportunities. And if you do all those things, I think you'll be much better positioned for the next 50 years because look back 50 years ago. One of the top songs in 1972 was American Pie. The other one was My Ding-a-Ling. Was that Chuck Berry? I would listen to music from like 1920s. 1970s is way too modern for me and my musical tastes. But if you look back, I mean, take where I'm from, the United States. California was a great place to live. It was functioning. It was thriving. It was like the place to be. It was a model utopia for other places in some ways. Where I lived as an adult for some time in Arizona next door was essentially like nothing. There was nobody there. It was like a territory. I mean, it was a state, obviously, but it was this very undeveloped place compared to what Phoenix is now and even Tucson is now. I mean, it was nothing. And you think 50 years is, in some sense, a long time, but it's also not at all a long time. And so look at what's happened in just your country in the last 50 years. Think about where the world was 50 years ago. And so then I think about this chart that I love so much from Visual Capitalist, where they say, look at the world's economy's progression from 2006 to 2036. So not 50 years, but 30 years. And the United States, being the number one economy, is going to grow about threefold, from 13.8 trillion to 43.2 trillion in that 30-year period. So in 2036, I'll be in my mid-50s, and you'll have seen the US triple. But look at China, 2.8 trillion to 55 trillion, basically a 20-fold growth. And then you look at the list of countries that's going to be in the list. And so the countries that have kind of won by default, it's one thing to say, okay, you live in the United States, the superpower, reserve currency, all that. How much of that's going to be the case in 50 years? I'm not going to be total doom and gloom guy because people have said, oh, any day now, world reserve currency's gone. Any day now, any day now. People have been saying that for 50 years, actually, and it hasn't happened. So you can make some case for the United States. The life expectancy is going down, taxes are going up, the culture's going in the wrong direction. You can't make that case for it, but you can say, hey, it'll maintain its superpower status. The countries that are going to collapse are the Italys, the Canadas, to some extent, Spain. I mean, how does Spain exist in a country where any other part of the world is competitive? And so you're going to see countries like Mexico rising in the ranks. You're going to see Indonesia, which has one of the largest populations in the world, rising in the ranks. Countries that you don't really know very much about. It's one thing to say, hey, I know about Canada, I know about Spain, I've been to Italy on vacation. I feel comfortable with this. Okay, I don't like Russia. They're not going to really be a big growth factor. But you're going to see Asian countries, rising, especially ones like Indonesia. African countries won't make it into some of the largest economies in the world, but they'll see dramatic gains. So countries like Nigeria will, have the potential to grow. You'll see which one of those countries in the frontier markets has good governance and makes some growth. But the Spains, the Australias, the Italys, they're going to be taking a dive because they just don't have the population. They're not reproducing fast enough. They just won't have the things that a less Western-centric world has in the next 50 years. So I look at this chart and I say, how do I want to prepare for the next 50 years to make sure that I'm still relevant? And if I'm having children now, I want them to still be relevant in the future. Talked to a family recently that has 5 kids and they're having their 6th and final child. The kids are all under like 10 years old. And so the idea was 50 years from now, they'll be anywhere from 49 to 60 years old. And so what will the world look like? one of the things from them coming from the United States is having access to live in only one country is really not going to be ideal. And so, as much as Europe has its problems, I'd rather be a citizen, and I've talked about Europe, the good and the bad, at great length. I'd rather have the option. There will be some semblance of a European Union. Will it be what it is in its current form? Perhaps not. But if you look back, again, 50 years ago, what was it? You had roughly 50 years ago a small group of countries that were more unified. That's something that you have in a group where you have so many small countries grouped together that the United States perhaps never will have, besides some kind of free trade deal with Canada and Mexico. And so I would like to have access to be able to live in different countries. Look, in Central America, you have the Central America Four. You can move between those. South America has Mercosur. The Caribbean has the Eastern Caribbean states. You can move between those. I would rather be a citizen of some country where, number one, I have some freedom of movement to other countries. If I'm a citizen of St. Lucia, as I am, I could go and be in St. Kitts and Nevis where the tax policy is better, and I'm not stuck on my one country the way I am in the United States. Now, sure, is it going to be easier for an American to get a residence permit in some countries? Sure, but the idea that an American, as we saw when Trump got elected, can just move to Canada is ridiculous. Canada's a rather difficult country, by and large, to immigrate to in terms of what you need to do, and especially if you're an entrepreneur or an investor and you don't want to go and get a job. Canada's tough. Mexico, as I said way back in 2015, is a much easier country. So I would look at what's the future of Mexico serving goods that are made in Mexico to the United States. When you look at the renegotiated NAFTA that was done under the Trump administration, it certainly created some extra work for factories in Mexico, but Mexico still has a dramatic advantage there. Mexico also has, in a world where they are, you can argue by some metrics, detaching themselves a little bit from the United States, plenty of natural resources like oil. And so, yeah, I'd be getting a Mexican residence, and I would give myself the optionality of having Mexican citizenship. I would have a South American residence and give myself an optionality of South American citizenship because I can move around South America more freely as a citizen. I would look at golden visas or citizenship by descent or Malta citizenship in Europe, especially if I've got a large family. Malta becomes much more interesting when there's, as in the case of this family, 7 or 8 of you, because you just add a small incremental payment for every person, and now everybody in the family, those kids have the opportunity to live, work, study, and travel as a European for the rest of their lives. And so not only getting access to more countries like Europe, the Caribbean, Central America, ASEAN to a lesser extent, those are difficult citizenships to get in Southeast Asia, but how do I have access to more countries? Because would I rather be American in a future geopolitical world that is less Western-centric, or would I rather be Belgian, right? Or would I rather be Bulgarian, right? Or whatever. I'd rather have the country that people are less aware of, because the United States, I don't think, as a passport, as an identity, will have as much cachet. If you're an American, you can go and do business in, let's say, the Gulf, for example, and you can be widely lauded, and you could be, sought after for being in business there. Is that going to be the case in 30 years as you're seeing countries like Saudi Arabia kind of pull away from the U.S. and kind of thumb their nose at the United States to a certain extent? Is that going to be as interesting? Something for someone who wants to ensure low taxes and they want to be in a part of the world that is a natural resources rich, would look at something like UAE residence, or even on a longer term basis, Saudi Arabia permanent residence. It's not going to work for a lot of folks, but having something that you can secure for the rest of your life. The geopolitics of the world are changing, and so relying on only your U.S. passport or Australian passport or British passport, where there's a certain stigma, I think, in the coming years to that in some parts of the world, a passport that's of equal quality in Malta that no one's ever really heard of and that nobody's upset with, a passport in a Caribbean country that won't follow you, that's very valuable. So as the United States, increasingly ticks off some of even its own allies, sure, a U.S. passport will always allow you to live and work in the United States, but if I'm looking to where is the action going to be, where are the opportunities going to be, where's the economic growth, where am I going to be best able to start a business, where am I going to be best able to invest my capital? Do I want to do that as a citizen of a country that already financially is strained? The United States has that issue. Some banks don't want to take the UK citizens after Brexit. We're seeing a few banks pushing back on Canadians now. So Western nationalities, due to all their regulations on the financial side, are increasingly being cut off from some of the best opportunities in the world. Americans can't invest in certain investments around the world because it doesn't comply with the SEC. Americans can't go and start businesses as easily in other countries where the culture is different, because American regulations follow them no matter where they go. And now you add on a layer of geopolitical issues as the world, the economy of the world has been shifting east for some time. The progression of wealth was moving to the west for a long time, and now it's moving back to the east. And so when that wealth comes, next comes the influence. And so how do I prepare for a world where there is that influence? You can have certain second citizenships. For example, some of the Caribbean countries are more favorable towards China, if you think that's the way to go. Others are favorable towards Taiwan. And so I think that, as we've seen with billionaire Peter Thiel, for example, recently hedging his bets, German, US, New Zealand, and perhaps now Maltese citizenship. How do you hedge your bets? I would say his portfolio is far too Western. I would say, how do I have something where, what are the countries that are going to grow? Not the countries that perhaps are the basket cases. Maybe I want to make a small frontier market investment there, whether it's in Africa or parts of South Asia, what have you. Maybe that's more of a speculative play. But if I have Armenian ancestry, can I get my Armenian citizenship? And that's not a great travel document, but it's a different kind of uncorrelated country. Now, it's a small country, so maybe I also want to go and get citizenship in a larger country. So next door, you probably wouldn't want both, but next door is Turkey. I can get citizenship there by buying a property or just putting money in the bank, and I can get that citizenship in 6 months. That's a country that has stood up to the Western mantra on geopolitics in the last year. And so if you think that that's the direction that the world is going, having access to that country, having access to the people that Turkey does business with, may not be the worst plan. So you've got to figure out where you think the world is going. The same could be said for what currencies you want to hold. The US dollar is certainly very strong and perhaps will be strong for some time to come. What does the future look like? Is that gold? Is that crypto? Is that whatever? So I don't have all the answers. None of us have all the answers. But if I look at how dramatically the world has changed in 50 years, when I was born in 1984, the United States was the best place to be born. It doesn't even make the list now. When they stopped making the list, it was certainly far from the top. If I look at the best economies for economic freedom, also not a list that's perfect, but it gives you some guideposts. The United States has fallen dramatically. Western countries have fallen dramatically. And somehow, I don't know how Australia and New Zealand, given not letting their own citizens in, have not fallen more dramatically. And so these are the things, the currency that people will use, the places people will invest, where the great businesses will be started. Certainly Silicon Valley will always be something, but I see lots of countries all around the world, from Israel to Armenia to Singapore, trying to compete and trying to take some slice of that away. Economies run at the margins. And so if some of these places gain traction and taking some slice away, you're going to see less relevance for California, less relevance for the United States. You've seen the geopolitical issues of, let's say, chip makers being based in Taiwan and what the US has to come in and do to ensure that they're going to get a supply of chips. And so what are all these things that are going to happen? There will be plenty of black swan events over the course of the next 50 years. And I think having multiple residences, citizenships, banking jurisdictions, and investment jurisdictions is going to be the best way to hedge against those. But these are the geopolitical questions, really, that I ask myself that are driven by the growth of economies. Indonesia, with a bigger economy and more relevance in the trading world, has a bigger voice in the influence. And it's probably going to be a different voice than the one that the United States or Canada or Spain would have. And so how are you going to adapt to that? I would say, don't change your values. Don't do something that makes you feel uncomfortable. But to a certain extent, if you can't beat them, join them. And so whether you like it or not, Indonesia is going to become a more successful, bigger part of the economy. That's going to lead to a bigger influence. That's going to happen in countries all around the world. And you're also going to see blocks of countries, again, like Mercosur in South America having that, or the BRICS, or whatever else it may be. And so I'm looking at having diversified passports that aren't entirely Western. Peter Thiel is on the right track with his plan to have 4 different passports if the news reports are true. But they're all Western. If they're going to all impose taxes on non-resident citizens, if they're all going to be lumped in as being on one side of the war, again, I'm not saying to play both sides of a literal war, but I'm saying I don't want to be kept out of opportunities, kept out of countries, kept out of living my life because my country chose to go to a war and the places where I need to be, they're like, yeah, we don't like your war. And so this is what I'm asking you to prepare for the next 50 years. Stop thinking of how am I going to get a second passport to prepare myself for the next pandemic. That could be an issue. Not even how do I get a second passport to prepare for higher taxes, but what am I doing for myself and future generations to make sure we're already covered, because the world is going to dramatically change even more than it has in the last 50 years, and you don't want to be stuck on the losing side that's losing ground.